Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alison Delmore, and I'm the Associate Director at the European Studies Center, and it is our great pleasure to have you all with us, joining us today for this installment of our Conversations on Europe virtual roundtable series. This session, we're using the 100th anniversary of the armistice of World War I to talk about that war, the impact of the Great War, as it was known, on Europe and on the rest of the world, and what lessons were learned coming out of that war. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to moderate it, and I'm very excited for the incredibly interdisciplinary panel that we've assembled today to talk about this. Before I launch into the introduction, I do want to introduce our panelists. First, I would like to welcome Professor Isabel Hull. She is the John Stamberg Professor of History at Cornell University. She received her PhD from Yale University in history, and her work focuses on the history of Germany since the 18th century, and on a wide range of topics, including gender and sexuality, military and legal cultures, and political theory. And we're very happy to have you today, Dr. Hull. I'd also like to welcome Olavi Arens. He is a professor of history at Georgia Southern University in Savannah, Georgia. He received his PhD from Columbia University in modern East European history and is a founding member and currently the academic executive director of the Association of the Advancement of Baltic Studies. So we're very happy to have you. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Arens. We have from Belgium, we are also pleased to welcome Pierre Bouchat. Dr. Bouchat is a postdoctoral researcher at the Université Catholique de Louvain and an invited lecturer at the Université Catholique de Louvain and the Université Libre de Bruxelles, where he received his PhD in social psychology with a focus on social representations and collective memory. He has a variety of research interests in psychology, including peace studies, collective memory and intergroup relationships, and post-conflict terror collective reactions. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Bouchat. And finally, on my left, we used to welcome in the room with me, Dr. Robert Hayden, who's a professor of anthropology, law, and public and international affairs here at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Hayden received his JD and his PhD in anthropology from SUNY Buffalo. And his professional research interests include ethnic and religious communal coexistence and conflict, archaeology of religion, socialist and post-socialist societies, nationalism, citizenship, and constitutionalism, and many more. So wide-ranging CV with lots of topics on it. So as you can see, it's an incredibly disciplinarily diverse panel. And so I'm really excited to dig into it and see what we can learn about World War I and its aftermath, especially since we've been hearing a lot this weekend about the commemorations of that war. Just to set things up, I first want to say that this event was made possible by a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence grant, and it is part of our Year of Global Europe. And so in that vein, we very much wanted to look at and take this moment of the centenary of the armistice to take as its starting point the end of World War I and look at what its global implications were on the world order, on Europe, on how Europe approached peace and war, and how individual nations were impacted coming out of this struggle. As you all know, World War I hope you all know, World War I began in 1914, essentially as a power struggle in the Balkans, but of course it quickly drew in all of the great powers of Europe, from Russia to Great Britain, most of the smaller ones as well, and then internationally, many countries, including the US. The fighting was contained mostly in Europe, although there were some skirmishes and some battles in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Pacific Islands. Most famously, of course, the Western Front stretched as a tangle of trenches from Belgium down through France. And the Eastern Front stretched along Russia's borders with Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and into the Balkans themselves. This was a global war in its scope for a variety of reasons, including the fact that soldiers participated from the colonial empires of Europe. So we had soldiers from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, Vietnam, Algeria, Senegal, Morocco, among others. And the U.S., of course, entered the war in 1917, which was the same year that Russia withdrew from the war as they were dealing with their own revolution that ended the Tsarist Empire and a subsequent civil war pitting red Bolsheviks against white Russians. While it was a war of horrors, specifically poisonous gas, the trenches, machine guns, airplanes bringing the war from above, the losses were still largely inflicted on combatants, but those losses were huge, and it took Europe a long time to recover. 1,800,000 Germans died, 1,700,000 Russians, almost 1,400,000 French, 1,300,000 from Austria-Hungary, around 900,000 from Britain and the British overseas empire. It contributed to a lost generation, men that would never write the poetry or, build the bridges or tell the stories. Women who would, of course, go without those men in forging ahead, and children who would never be born. It was also, of course, men who would never recover from the experiences of war. In the summer of 1918, with the influx of fresh troops from the U.S. and faltering support from German allies, Germany finally capitulated, and the war ended with an armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 100 years ago, yesterday. In the wake, empires crumbled. The European self-confidence was eroded. And the American President Wilson made a stirring declaration of 14 points to move forward, including the redrawing of Europe's boundaries and the respecting of self-determination, which was a concept that was left rather vague in those 14 points. And as Wilson later admitted, he didn't really have a clear understanding of nationalism as it might exist at the time. And yet that seems to be a good jumping off point for us, because this past weekend, as many of you know, French President Emmanuel Macron took the opportunity of the centenary to make a denouncement of nationalism and its evils, and specifically pointed to nationalism as one of the lessons that we could draw from World War I. And so, as we bring together our panelists, that's one of the points that I sort of want to use as a jumping off point, because I think we've all been watching what's been going on in the news. And I want to use this kind of idea of nationalism as a starting point to discuss some of these issues. So we're going to kind of take a regional approach, given the expertise of our experts. And I think I want to start to my left here with you, Bob. Given that a lot of this that happened in 1914 is triggered by events in the Balkans, what can you tell us about some of the important consequences of World War I in the Balkan region?
Okay, thanks, Allison. That's a good one to start. And I should say I came back 10 days ago after 5 months in the former Yugoslavia, where the consequences are very interesting indeed. Because if you ask how World War I is remembered in the Balkans, it depends on where you are. Serbia was the only country that was involved from 1914 to 1918, was the original victim, and also lost more than 20% of its entire population, not just combatants, and close to 40% of the male population, and came out a victor. They have very different memories of it than the Bulgarians, who lost World War I, and well, they lost the Second Balkans War, World War I, which then was the Third Balkans War, and World War II. They have very different memories of it. The Greeks, Greek memorials go to fighters killed in the wars from 1912 to 1923. So World War I was a part of it, but not the main part of it for the Greeks. The start of the war, the commemoration of the assassination in Sarajevo, which actually didn't start. The war started with the Austrian attack on Belgrade on the night of 28th of July 1914. That was fascinating because in Sarajevo, the Croats and the Bosniaks uh, essentially denigrated the assassination and rehabilitated the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Croats are now saying that their misfortune was that they were on the wrong side of World War I and World War II, which is really quite fascinating for all sorts of reasons. But it fits with the larger theme. Christopher Clark's famous best-selling book that made him a large amount of money, and the title for advancing British-German relations, and he chaired professorship in Britain, is essentially a rehabilitation of the original Austro-Hungarian and German rationales for the war. Which is what now sells in a Europe that is dominated by Germany. So in the Balkans, the consequences played out in varying ways. The initial consequences of formation of a larger Yugoslavia that is not there anymore. And we can get into the nationalism issues in regard to that, but I don't want to go on for too much longer. For the other Balkan states, rather interestingly, the ones that existed at the time, Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, World War I on its own didn't have that much impact. What had impact on Bulgaria was losing the Second Balkans War. What had an impact on Greece was losing the war with Turkey from 1920 to 1923, disaster in Anatolia. And the Albanians sat out everything. The Serbs are actually quite bitter that the war is now blamed on them, and that they're also their role as the victor, but also as the single nation that suffered the heaviest casualties in the entire war is forgotten.
Thank you very much for that. In terms of thinking about, there's a lot of points I want to come back to in that, but you brought up the point of sort of rehabilitating this Austro-Hungarian and German rationale for war. So I think I'd like to go over to Dr. Hull now. We know that coming out of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles placed very harsh penalties on Germany for their role in the war. And so I guess I want to go to you and think about what was that rationale for going to war, and how would you characterize sort of German responsibility for bringing about the war in the first place?
We might look at it like this. Obviously, the revulsion in Germany against the Treaty of Versailles was almost universal. It stretched from the far right to the far left, actually. And it's a result of, I think, the German public operating under three lies, which were very successfully produced by the Imperial German government and maintained throughout the war and beyond. The first one was that Germany did not start the war, which it did. The second one was that it was a defensive war, that the war was originally blamed on Russian aggression, which was in fact not forthcoming in 1914. And it was then transferred over to Great Britain, actually fairly quickly in the fall of 1914, when Britain entered the war in August already. And the third lie was that Germany didn't lose the war, and the German public had never been told about the consequences of the First Battle of the Marne. They were continuously told that the war, and actually many people who were telling them this believed it to be true, that Germany would win the war, that the collapse of Russia and the advent of the Soviet Union and then the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk made that believable. But the upshot of all of this was that the expectation and hope in Germany from the Auswärtige, from the Foreign Office on down, was that the resulting peace treaty would have been the result of negotiations among equals, as though Germany had not lost the war, and that it would emerge from whatever came as a great power unreduced in any respect from its actions in the war. And that was, of course, completely unrealistic. And it's therefore, and that's the sort of basis for the memory and popular opinion in Germany at the time, not any longer, but at the time. If you look at the armistice, and it's been disappointing to me in the commemorations, that the armistice itself is an important and interesting document because Germany, of course, began the request for an armistice, and this was actually the last sort of ruse of Imperial Germany. And their hope was that the armistice would in fact stave off military defeat, an obvious, clear destruction of the German army, which Ludendorff, the chief of staff, expected to happen daily at the end of September of 1918. And so the idea was to hive the Foreign Office directed its request for an armistice to the United States in the hopes of hiving the United States, which was just an associated power and not an ally, off from the other allies, and getting a peace on the basis of the 14 points, which would have permitted Germany to keep Alsace-Lorraine, and which would have essentially erased the odium of losing the war. And if the war was understood then as lost, you could blame it on the new civilian reform government, which was the one that presented the request for the armistice. The Allies understood the ruse. They saw through it immediately. In fact, they were going to reject the armistice. In that first meeting, when the news comes in France, they don't even discuss it. It's not even on the agenda. But as things went on, basically what the reason that the Allies accepted the armistice, and in fact the gap between Wilson and the Allied representatives closed in the course of October with the negotiations between the United States and Imperial Germany, that basically the Allied understanding was that, in fact, Germany had been militarily defeated. It was surely strategically defeated. In all probability, it would have been defeated militarily completely. In the fall of 1918, it wouldn't even have been necessary to go into 1919. And so what the document does is to basically make it impossible for Germany to continue the war, to resume the war after a period of rest, which was Ludendorff's idea, and the Allies therefore understand victory and defeat differently from the way the Germans understood it. The Germans understood defeat to mean strictly military defeat, of the annihilation of an army, and this is the idea behind the Schlieffen Plan, and it's the kind of military obsession of the Imperial Germans. The Allies understood that Germany had been defeated strategically, and that a diplomatic document would suffice if it were backed up with the kind of guarantees that are in the armistice, and which then continue in the treaty, so that the armistice is a preview, actually, of the treaty itself. But because the population, and particularly the politically active part of the German population, and significant sectors in the government still operate according to, and we'll add the armistice as the fourth lie, are operating according to that, the whole schema of the Allies, which is to reform the European state system since 1814, 1815, and to make it more modern and more effective. That is the system that Germany had gone to war, in essence, to overturn. the Allied idea is that you use a diplomatic document, which is a legal document then, and that the Treaty of Versailles is then a legal document to set up a system which would work, which, however, from the German perspective, given their assumptions about why the war had happened, what it was about, and how it had ended, was a non-starter.
Thank you for that. There's so many interesting places to go from there. And I want to get back to them. But one point that came up is that I'm curious about is how were German elites so successful at hiding from the public what exactly what was happening in terms of military? What was going on?
Yes. Okay. It's a great question. The imperial government had known since 1907 that the socialists, which was the largest party in Germany, that the socialists would fight in a defensive war, but that they would not fight in a war for offensive war aims. And that set the foreign policy of Germany actually from that time, that any major war that would break out would have to be couched as though Russia had begun it. And the manner in which that was done at the end of July and the beginning of August 1914 was to argue that Russian mobilization against Austria, and first against Austria, but then again the troops bordering on Germany, that mobilization meant war. And that was the basic argument that the German Foreign Office used and that the newspapers then reprinted. That isn't true. The Russian army can mobilize and sit on its borders indefinitely. It had tried that out already in 1912, 1913. The only country for whom mobilization meant war was, in fact, Imperial Germany. No other country had to immediately begin, in Germany's case, within 3 hours going into Luxembourg, a neutral country. Only Germany had that. But so you could say, and here we could ask the social psychologist what he believes, that this was an assumption that existed in Germany and which you might say they had projected onto other nations, but it was not true. So that's one thing. The way that you could uphold the idea of, and that the argument then that Germany did not start the war and that it was a defensive war merge. So if you say that Russia started the war, then it is a defensive war, ipso facto. So those two things come together. You can argue that Germany didn't lose it because the war was not fought on German soil, and because, in fact, Germany remained in control of substantial parts of the continent at the time of the armistice, especially, of course, in the east. Brest-Litovsk meant an enormous expansion of Germany into the east through the Baltic and beyond, and those areas were still under German control. So it was relatively easy to make the argument that Germany had not lost the war. And then later, of course, the National Socialists and other right-wingers will make the argument that the socialists, whom they equate with Jews, had sold out Germany and made it lose a war that it had, in fact, actually won or could have won under better leadership, basically.
Thank you. And thank you for providing such a great transition, because you gave me ways to go to both Dr. Beauchat and Dr. Arendt. So thinking about this idea that, of course, the war wasn't fought predominantly on German soil, but it certainly was on Belgian soil. And so turning to you, Dr. Beauchat, can you talk to us a little bit about sort of Belgian perceptions of the war and experience through it, and what you've learned from your own research?
So so I'm a psychologist, but from an historical point of view, what I can say is that Belgium was invaded in the first hours of the war. It opposed fierce resistance to the German troops, and what was very specific in Belgium is the slaughterings of civilians. Well, based on a memory on fears that were related to the previous war against France. They were super afraid of francs-tireurs, so civilians that would shoot them in the back, and many German troops began slaughtering hundreds of civilians. And well, it stayed in our collective memory for since now, actually, in very specific villages and cities. There are a lot of traces of these slaughterings. In my I am.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. In my personal studies, I'm much less interested in Belgium than actually in the whole Europe. So I could just say that in the vivid memory, it's still alive in very small villages in Belgium.
Great, and I think we'll come back to this idea of the collective memory as it goes throughout. And we are going to open up a chance for questions soon to the audience. So I'm sure people are also gathering their thoughts as well. But we also, sort of heard about this. The Germans still had a lot of territory, particularly in the east and up through the Baltics. So this gives me a good segue for you, Dr. Arendt. Could you talk to us a little bit about what the experience was for the Baltic states, particularly immediately after World War I?
Fine. I think you're absolutely right. It's the period after the war that is more important, and certainly in terms of memory in the Baltics and probably, let's say, I think Poland and Finland also, and that is because there were no independent states here at the time of the outbreak of World War I. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles were all simply mobilized into the Russian army, and they are part of the statistics of the casualties in the Russian army. And yet it is very interesting, there are almost no monuments to reflect that. I can think of seeing one monument in Estonia, one parish, which had a list of people in the parish who were killed in World War I, and then on the other side, the deaths in the War for Independence, which came afterwards in 1919. So yes, the memorials in the cemeteries and elsewhere are for the post-World War I period. But again, the experience, I was very interested in listening to the description in the Balkans, and one can look at these various parts of the Baltics and so on. And again, the experiences vary, and people have slightly different memories. In the case of Finland, for example, Finland as a autonomous part of the Russian Empire, there was no mobilization, so Finns did not participate in any, to a large extent, in World War I, except as volunteers. And then with the others, we have the German occupation, which of course first in Poland and then Lithuania and then the southern part of Latvia, and that means that there's no longer going to be any further participation as far as fighting of people being mobilized in those areas, and that is followed, of course, by the Russian Revolution. But to get very specifically to sort of answer your question of the post-war period, Versailles actually meant resumption of fighting. It was not peace, because after Brest-Litovsk, the rest of the Baltics were occupied by Germany. A German division participated in Finnish Civil War, but there was no fighting in 1918. Once you had the armistice, 2 days later, Lenin denounced the armistice, and as a result, one had Red Army incursions into the area, and actually 1919 is a period of fighting in the area, culminating, of course, with the Polish-Soviet War in 1920.
So, we want to, if I teach a Western Civ course or an introduction to European history, we have to get through this period quickly, right? So we think of the period immediately after the fighting as this time where people are coming together from around the world and trying to be architects of peace through the Paris Conference and through creation of a series of treaties, including Versailles, which we've mentioned before. And I want to talk a little bit about this sort of peacemaking process and some of the strategies that were employed in the various areas of Europe and the world. But I guess what I want to go back to really quickly with you, Dr. Bouchat, is can you talk a little bit about some of your research on how the war impacted attitudes towards peace and war?
Yeah, so we were interested in the links between objective indicators of victimization during the war, and we conceptualized them at 2 levels of the social. The first level was the societal level, and so we took the percentage of losses of death by country during First World War, and the second level of the social was the family level. And we asked participants if they lost an ancestor during First World War, yes, no, or I don't know. We had participants from 23 European countries, and that were between 18 and 25. So what we see is that when we run a specific type of statistics that are called multi-level statistics, the more a country suffered during World War I, the more its young citizens will be pacifist. But if they suffered in their own blood, if they lost an ancestor, they will be less pacifist. So it's very strange that the same objective victimization leads to opposite effects. We consider them at 2 different levels of the social. And our suggestion is that at the level of the societies, countries that were highly victimized were threatened by the kind of enemy, and then constructed a specific representation favoring peace. And on the opposite, people in their own families, they kept being in a vindicative logic. Yeah.
Interesting. And that I think might help us transition into sort of the post-war settlements and this kind of balance between vindication that you see in the Treaty of Versailles in particular, and this sort of trying to construct a new world order that will prevent future wars with the League of Nations and this attempt to redraw boundaries so that people are happy where they are. So I guess I want to ask, I guess, sort of, what do you think that some of what was happening in Paris and these architects of peace, did they have a direct implication on what you were mentioning earlier that was going on in the Balkans afterwards, with this sort of the importance of the fighting that happens after?
Well, I mean, Yugoslavia is a special case for all sorts of reasons, and that's also going to be true in terms of the commemoration, because it was Serbia's victory. It becomes Yugoslavia, but much of the commemoration is overwhelmed by the communist period. Serbian victors are regarded to be Serbian nationalists, and so that's all kind of suppressed. In terms of the other states, it was the Treaty of Sevres that affected Greece, that gave Greece chunks of Anatolia. And that, of course, Ataturk rejected, and it leads to the Treaty of Lausanne, and which leads to the great ethnic cleansing of Anatolia and Greece, for that matter, the exchange of populations. So that's one where you can say that the peace treaties, that the peace treaty failed completely. Of course, it failed because the Greeks read it as a charter for them to establish a greater Greece and to move forward in an offense, and that didn't work out. That didn't work out very well. In terms of the ways that the borders were drawn around Yugoslavia, it's quite interesting. A lot of it was done by plebiscite, and that passed fairly peacefully and led to peaceful divisions in Slovenia, and particularly between Serbia and Romania in Banat. One of the very few cases in Europe where you have neighboring nations that peacefully divided a territory and have not had any history of enmity. Well, that's probably because they both have a history of enmity with the Hungarians. But hey, for Europe, this is what you have to expect. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Yeah, I mean, and I want to look, because I think there are some interesting comparisons, but they're two distinct cases, but they're both trying to deal with fallout of the sort of dissolving of empires, right? The Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman. So if we go up north to the Baltics, Dr. Arens, the same kind of question for you. Is there stuff coming out of the peace process that is being reckoned with in terms of these nationalist struggles that are happening in the Baltics, or is it primarily is it more a result of what's happening on the east, in the east with what's going on in Russia?
I think my answer would be quite similar, I think, to what was happening in the Balkans. I look upon Versailles as a way station that started with Brest-Litovsk as really the first piece, or the two treaties, because you should remember that there was also a treaty with Ukraine. So there are two treaties at Brest-Litovsk as the beginning, and Versailles as a continuum, and the end point comes only with the very specific treaties in 1920 and 21 that Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, and Poland make with the Soviet Russian, and this is before there was a USSR, so it was Soviet Russia, sign. And so it's at that point that fighting comes to an end, and borders are drawn. Versailles set the western border of Poland, but not the eastern border. The eastern border came afterwards, and result is again Versailles. Yes, the presidents of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were in Paris with the celebrations, but there was not much going on and not much reaction in the press as I checked. In Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. 1918 is the year of the declarations of independence, and the 100th anniversaries of the declarations of independence. Finland is a little bit earlier in December 6, 1917, but then the others are in 1918. They're the ones. These declarations were celebrated in this year. Versailles reaction is muted.
Hey, thank you. Thanks. So I have a ton of questions, and I would like to talk about sort of the League of Nations and this attempt at cooperation and multilateralism. But this is the time that we normally open it up for questions, and I have a feeling we have some in the room. I also want to take a moment that if you've joined remotely, and please use the chat function, and my colleague Iris will communicate your question to us. But for those of you who are in a room in Illinois, if you want to wave your hands if you have a question, or here, I would invite any of my colleagues here at Pitt if any of you have questions to pose to our panel. Yes, Dr. Spoon.
So I was wondering if we could talk a bit about sort of the suffrage movement as something that came out of sort of followed World War I. So we had an earlier conversation in this room in September talking about sort of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, primarily in the European context. And I was wondering if anyone wanted to kind of address sort of, in terms of one of the legacies or one of maybe sort of the more positive things that kind of came out of the armistice, the end of the war, and sort of how that transition was made in the UK and in some of the other European countries.
If I may, let me say something about the Northeast Europe. Finland, of course, was, as an autonomous part of the Russian Empire, introduced women's suffrage before World War I. So it acted as a pioneer. And then came 1917, the Russian Revolution. And of course, in the Russian, in the context of 1917, women's suffrage was introduced. So there was women's suffrage for the elections to the Russian Constituent Assembly in the fall of 1917. And in Estonia, now which was not under German occupation in 1917, and which went right through all of the processes of the Russian Revolution, this meant automatically that again women's suffrage came into being. Elsewhere, I think it came in the Constituent Assembly elections. Constituent Assembly elections in 1919 and 1920, which occurred in all of these countries, women's suffrage was accepted in Poland and in all of the Baltics.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, we lost one of our panelists, so we're waiting to bring. Speaking of giving women the right to speak, we have cut her off. Yes. No, it's an interesting question, and it was certainly one that interesting. Sort of Wilson was sympathetic to and was taking audiences with women while in Paris to talk about possibilities moving forward for the states. And I have a feeling, given her work,
yes,
that Dr. Hull will probably have something to say to that, but we will come back to it. Are there any other questions while we wait for that reappearance? Oh, she's back. So, go ahead.
I was hoping that she would be back because my question
There she is.
may be most properly addressed by Professor Hull.
She's back, Dr. Hull, yes.
I've always been interested, and you made allusion to this when you talked about Wilson's 14 points. I've always been interested in the fact that the leaders who decided post-war world decided that some representation and freedom of self-determination were good and would apply and would be rewarded, and some would not. In the latter category, for example, you have the Croats, Slovaks, and Poland took over a piece of Ukraine, and nobody said anything about that. I'd like to know a little bit about how were those decisions, made on strategic grounds, or were there people? I know there were at the conference sort of lobbying in favor of quote unquote their group, and since it was to some extent, and of course nobody cared about the Hungarians because they were considered to have participated in the beginning of the war. So you had all of these aggrieved groups on the wrong side of new borders. And I'd like to know a little about how those decisions were made, if there's a way to characterize it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Well, in the case of, I don't know about the Slovaks, okay, we're in Pittsburgh. And the Pittsburgh Agreement to form a joint Czechoslovak state was signed by Masaryk, and they accepted that. So Masaryk, of course, having been a leading figure in the independence movement in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and with a greater reputation. He traveled on a Serbian passport before and during the war. So that was, recognizing both Masaryk's and also then they had the document that they could stand on, right, which was the Pittsburgh agreement. And I don't think actually that's really contested even by the Slovaks these days.
Well, during the interwar period, they pointed out that this agreement was signed by Slovak emigres, not by Slovaks.
Yeah. But you're talking about 1918, and if they're looking for something, remember their primary concern in setting up Czechoslovakia was screwing Germans, right? Because there were more Germans than there were Slovaks in Czechoslovakia set up. So why wasn't it Czechoslovakia? But since part of the point was to divide the German population, that's what they're interested in. In regard to the Slovenes and the Croats, among others, I mean, Yugoslavia was originally a Croat idea, and there was the Yugoslav Committee, and actually the resistance they had to overcome initially was from the Serbs, who go into it and say, hey, Serbia won this war. We want to come out of it as Serbia. No, you're going to come out of it as Yugoslavia, which is actually what Gavrilo Princip wanted. Gavrilo Princip was a Yugoslav. When he assassinated the Archduke, it was to establish a Yugoslavia. So again, that seemed to be following a substantial domestic opinion, while also rewarding, in that case, the original victim and one of the original victors, because although it hasn't been mentioned, there were military successes on the Thessaloniki front in 1918 that essentially by October, had opened up the road to Budapest, had opened up the road to Vienna, so that the Soviet powers had crumbled there as well. And so that was all recognizing a Serb, Croat, Slovene state without defining it, but under the Serbian kingdom. I mean, that I can see where that made a great deal of political sense, and responded to a lot of political activity from local actors. Not all of them, but nobody always wins. What I think is more interesting, and of course Hitler played on this, was that the Germans were designing self-determination. Mm-hmm. And also, I started out as a South Asianist, and one of the great consequences of 1918 at Versailles is the explosion of self-determination movements in places like India and Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I mean, Ho Chi Minh was in Paris at the time, sort of famously, although anecdotally, and he tried to get a visa, apparently.
If I may add something, the picture is very mixed in Northeast Europe, and I have worked with Wilson for quite a while, and I find it a very difficult task trying to understand him. But yes, Poland was of course part of the 14 points, point 13. So Wilson advocated the restoration of Poland. With Finland, the United States recognized Finland in May 1919 during the Versailles Peace Conference. Herbert Hoover wrote a very strong letter of support to Wilson on this. But when it came to the Baltic states, Wilson refused. United States policy is very mixed, with some members of the American delegation supporting Baltic independence, Colonel House, for example, and I think ultimately Herbert Hoover. But Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State, was committed to a Russia, united Russia. Wilson himself, only in June, right at the end of the Versailles Conference, made his position clear, and I think he made it when he refused to follow the recommendation of the Baltic expert on the Peace Commission, Morrison, who resigned as a result of this issue. As Samuel L. Morrison, later historian at Harvard, recommended that Wilson receive an Estonian delegation, and Wilson refused to do this, and shortly afterwards indicated to the Russian ambassador to the United States, Boris Bashmetov, that he fully agreed with him about the integrity of Russia, minus Poland and Finland. So Wilson, in his speeches, when it comes to the Russian Empire, talks very much Russia and Russians. And I don't think he fully realizes the complexity or the ethnic makeup of the Russian Empire.
May I say something?
Yes, please.
The idea of self-determination, of course, has a very long history, and it goes back. It was recognized actually as a principle on the basis of which governments would be formed at the Congress of Vienna, which is otherwise rejected as a completely reactionary kind of thing, and it was not. And that was.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. No.
Have we lost everybody else?
All right. Well, it looks like we lost her again. Hopefully we'll get her right back. But I think that this is really interesting, and I'm looking forward to it. Okay. Dr. Holt, yes, now it's back. Yes, sorry about that. We did lose you.
All right.
Yes.
It's the basis of liberalism, which argued that self-determination was a rational schema of putting together government, and it then swells actually in the late 1850s, 1860, 1871 with Italian and German unification, which arguably then changes nationalism, which was your starting point, from something that is more liberationist to something that can be quite repressive of other folks. The movement of Wilson and Wilson's 14 points, these are, among other things, rather clearly a reaction to Lenin's international arguments about the proper basis of government and the rest, and the interaction. In other words, the World War I produces a dynamism in the self-determination issue, and the problem for the folks at Versailles who were trying to set this up is, of course, there are no rational borders on the basis of ethnicity, language, or culture, because Europe is a mishmash. And that's why they produced the minority treaties. That is to say that anyone who that these two places, and it was started with Poland with the treaty with Poland, but it affected everybody else as well. The idea was that, yes, there were going to be minorities within all of ethnic, linguistic, or cultural minorities within all of the new states, and there were supposed to be then guarantees for them that they would not be oppressed by the majority folks. And the other major issue that folks at the Treaty of Versailles had to face was that these entities had to be economically viable, and hence the Polish corridor going through Danzig, which is ethnically speaking a German city, the problem of the Sudetenland, and above all the problem that Rump Austria wanted to become part of Germany, and that was forbidden. That's Anschluss, right? And that has to do with power considerations, because oddly enough, Germany had emerged from a lost war as being relatively stronger than any of the other continental powers. And the notion that now it would get the Austrians together with Germany would make it demographically stronger still. And so these are all things, in other words, the original liberal theory from the 1780s about self-determination is an idea which is fine in the abstract, but is in fact not possible of being created really on the ground in its pure form. And that was something that pretty much everybody had recognized, but it puts you in a problem when you try to explain what it is you're doing. And Wilson and the others as well had that problem.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking of another idea sort of borrowed from the same tradition from the past. This, is this the time for kind of international cooperation? Is this time for a League of Nations? Is this the time for, international workers groups? Is this the time for not just diplomatic and possibly political cooperation, but more economic cooperation? And there's these appeals made for kind of creating an American-led something like that would look like the Marshall Plan at the end of World War II, right? And this doesn't happen. But what does happen is the League of Nations. And could you talk a little bit about that, about what came out of those discussions?
Are you referring to me?
Yes, please.
Okay. The idea behind the League of Nations was not Wilson's idea. The idea of the League of Nations actually comes out of Britain and its foreign office and the discussions that go very early on in when the war has begun, because clearly the idea of the collective security that the Concert of Europe had offered after 1814-15 has clearly broken down, because Germany, with Austria in tow, has rejected it and gone against it, and that's what gives you the war. And so the idea was to pick up on the enormous strides that had been made in arbitration and mediation. For example, in 1899, the creation of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. In July of 1914, Russia had offered to put the Austro-Serbian problem before that body, and that was turned down by both Austria and Germany as an idea. And so the idea of the League of Nations is to continue to institutionalize that on a larger basis, to provide collective security through that basis, and that in the event that a country like Germany would go against that, you had then automatic sanctions that would begin with economic sanctions and then would potentially escalate into military sanctions. The problem, of course, with that was that, in effect, it would have been the old great powers who would have been the main operator, sort of the operandum there, and they actually preferred, in effect, to do it the old way, so that when you see the problem in Ethiopia, or when you see the Spanish Civil War, or when you see Japan in Manchuria, they don't actually use the League of Nations. They tend to use bilateral and other forms of pressure. So that the League of Nations, on some very basic level, was never tried in terms of mediation or dealing with actual armed conflict. It was tried in economics. The International Labor Organization was actually quite effective in many of the things that it did. And the mediation in terms of, for example, in Silesia, dealing with ethnic difficulties there actually worked. But in terms of conflict, I would argue the League of Nations was never really tried. And it's perfectly clear that if you understand the manner in which it was supposed to work and the rest, that the United Nations is very clearly then the kind of improvement of the League of Nations. And so there's a very strong continuity into the present day in all kinds of realms, and these are, of course, exactly the realms that the American president is in the business of throwing out with nothing to replace them, which, frankly, I find completely shocking.
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably should transition to that because it's been on a lot of minds lately, and sort of the American role in this. There's a number of comparisons being made in the last week, especially, between Trump's America First policies and American foreign policy after World War I. So I guess my question out there, and I know that the number of you sort of talked about this or worked on it in your work, is that comparison apt? Is there a lesson that's not being learned here, or is the comparison overwrought? You know, is it being over dramatized?
Me?
So, sure.
If
I'll let anyone address that one.
I'll just very quickly say, since I've already said it, it is not being over dramatized. I think actually we will get through it because it is in the interests of most nations to use these instruments of international law, international institutions, international cooperation, and exchange. That fits most places most of the time, and that's why I think it will actually survive. But it is nonetheless quite shocking that an American president with without a fare thee well, simply tosses these things as though they were without basis and not in our interests. I find it really completely shocking. It is the most shocking thing that a shocking administration has done.
That's saying something. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, although I have to say that in terms of the weakening of the United Nations, Trump is simply completing processes that have been started by other administrations. I mean, the Security Council was rendered inoperable in terms of preventing aggression when Bill Clinton decided to bomb Serbia. And the Russians shortly thereafter had their war against Georgia. So it's meant that the superpowers or the major powers are no longer bound by the Security Council in the way that they were, and that is a consequence of the United States seeing itself as what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation and the hyperpower. So if you anticipate getting an effective United Nations again, it's going to require more of what Henry Kissinger, of course, would love, is a balance of power.
Dr. Arens, I think you had a comment as well.
Okay, I just wanted to follow up, going back to the League. I always have regarded one of the early success stories is dealing with refugees. The Nansen passport system, which was used Russian refugees from the Civil War, Armenian refugees, and it's something that is new. So we need to look at the League of Nations in a more positive light, I think, than what is usually the case with history textbooks in looking at the failures. But there were the successes in the humanitarian issues and labor issues and I know, I mean, these labor issues, the ILO, they had an impact in the Baltic states, for example. When one looked at legislation, they did look at what was recommended by the ILO.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's some. I ran across the interesting tidbit when I was doing some background reading about thinking about how it always, the way that it's portrayed in the textbooks, right, is it just didn't go far enough. The Americans didn't commit, they didn't ratify, they didn't, join the League of Nations. So they didn't go far enough and really put the money where their mouth was. They retreated back into kind of isolationism. And I thought it was interesting finding the little tidbit that France's Minister of Commerce, a man by the name of Clément, wanted to create much more economic cooperation and create a new world order that would be more bound together through economic cooperation. And interestingly enough, his assistant at the time was Jean Monnet. So it always, the story in the textbooks seems to be that they kept having these great ideas but didn't go far enough, or they had these ideas but they didn't understand what self-determination would mean in the context of this mishmash, or when I think the great example when you look, Ron, at your question of sort of when did they choose to honor nationalist self-determination and when did they ignore it, was this sort of total lack of any kind of understanding of Arab nationalism and where it might go, right? And kind of a devaluation of it almost in the Middle East.
Yeah, but I wonder sometimes recognizing self-determination didn't have a practicality. Because there were very strong independence movements in the Austro-Hungarian Empire as there had been in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the Ottoman Empire had disintegrated in Europe because of self-determination movements, liberation movements, starting with Serbia in 1801, 1817, Greece gets it in 1830, Serbia effectively in 1867. And this is actually all before, it starts before the Italian and other movements. How are you going to impose a state? And what are you going to do? Are you then going to support the maintenance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when you've got then not only the mobilization politically and the mobilization on the ground people by folks like Masaryk? How are you going to do that? And why would you do that? Right? So self-determination has its problems, but it is also seems to be, this is a wave. This is what's going on, and that they're going to consolidate. Well, as Eugen Weber said, France, they had to make Frenchmen of them, or okay, now we've made Italy, now we have to make Italian. So the fact that now we've made Yugoslavia, now we need to make Yugoslavs, or Czechoslovakia, now we need to make Czechoslovaks, right? I mean, sure, why not? I mean, yeah.
Fine. Let me add something. Can I? Yeah. Add some. When I asked the question, why the Baltic states? Yes, I mean, they justified themselves in terms of self-determination. But it became very clear at Versailles that this was not enough. At the end of the conference, the Baltic states were not recognized. The Estonian foreign minister basically noted in his diary as he leaving Paris, well, what we have to do now is negotiate with the enemy, i.e. the Bolsheviks. And of course, it proved to be a successful policy. But why? And Lenin's government then recognized, yes, dealt with the Baltic states and so on in terms of a doctrine of self-determination. But the answer, why the Baltic states and so on. Well, if one looks at the British Foreign Office view on this, when they were first asked this question, as they analyzed it, the analysis went something like this. Well, if the Baltic reverted back to Russia, that would be acceptable. I mean, this is what we've had for centuries, and we've been able to work it. If the Baltic states became independent, we can accept that also, as long as trade is open to the hinterland, into Russia. What we cannot accept is German domination of the Baltics and German control, in a sense, of the trade routes into Russia. So from the British perspective, again, this was an acceptable. From the Soviet perspective, this was acceptable, better than a German-dominated Baltic. And ultimately, in a sense, Weimar
And we have another question.
In terms of the link between that period and this period, the commonality and the dynamics is that you have great power. The realist would say the great powers determining what happens. Self-determination is a great principle. You can hang it out there and say you're doing it, but in fact, nobody cared, for example, of the self-determination of the Turks. After the war, great powers, including Greece, as Bob mentioned, set about carving up Turkey, and they were just unable to. In terms of organizations, the comparison between the League and the United Nations, as loath as I am to disagree with my colleague, the Security Council was neutered long before Bill Clinton. The great powers set it up that way. They set it up that way. They weren't completely willing to hand over power. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, just you name it, they went on without recognition of that. In that sense, people criticize the United Nations the same way they do the League. But it's like Professor Hull said about the League before. They're not used because the powers involved don't want them to be used. Only if they can use them in their own way. And by the way, one final point, they are not alone in this. When the International Tribunal in The Hague ruled against China in the South China Sea, they just ignored it.
Sure, yeah. I think we have pragmatism, naivete, realism. It's all a fun blend when we're talking about international world order and politics.
Although I would say one thing, Ron, the Korean War was a UN operation because the Soviet representative walked out of the Security Council, therefore didn't veto it, and so it was actually a UN force.
But when he came back and did veto it.
Yeah, but they had a UN flag. It was a UN force. It was a UN operation. Vietnam had the fig leaf of the United States being invited in by the South Vietnamese government, the same way that the Russians had the fig leaf of being invited in by the Afghan government. What Bill Clinton did and that George H.W. Bush hadn't done when he attacked Iraq, what he got Security Council approval. And this was an aggressive attack, not invited by a local government, and that the Security Council would not approve, and the U.S. did it anyway, and that was an that really destroyed the authority of the Security Council, which was not as strong. Yeah, but still at least was honored to some extent.
I'm going to pull this back to the centenary and getting near time. So I wanted to give a chance to kind of pull back to this moment that we're in, where we're talking about the 100-year anniversary. And since 2014, there have been a number of commemorations. This has been kind of played out since the 100 years since the start of World War I, and now we're at the 100 years since the armistice. So I just wanted to ask each of our panelists if they could reflect on, now that we're at the tail end of these centenary commemorations of the Great War, what themes have you noticed being most prevalent in those commemorative events? And what do you think is being left out? And if you do think something's being left out, why do you think that is? We can go in any order, so as people feel inspired.
Well, should I?
Bob's inspired.
Yeah. Well, if you read the Versailles Treaty, the war started on the night of July 28th with the attack on Serbia, and was an aggressive war. And where was the start of the war commemorated? It was not commemorated in Serbia. For that matter, it wasn't even commemorated in Sarajevo. It was commemorated in Belgium, right? Or was it France? It was in Belgium. Commemorated in Belgium, and it's really quite fascinating. The whole commemoration is about what a great mistake this is. And of course, Christopher Clark's book about how, they just stumbled into this. They were sleepwalking, stumbling into this, which is nonsense. I mean, even the Austrian and German historians in the 1960s were saying, yeah, they knew that they were going to start a larger European war. They also knew they would likely lose it, but this was the only way that they had to preserve the empire. And I find it really quite fascinating that the war is now seen not to have been intentional in some ways, when it clearly was. It was a war of choice. It was a war of choice by both the Austrians and by the Germans. But of course, you're in the European Union, in a Europe where Germany is dominant. And that's not a narrative that you want to push. So I find the commemorations to have been distinctly odd. Even in Serbia, they didn't, I would have thought they would have commemorated, it was there on that. They didn't commemorate it much because they can't go against the general European trend.
Hello?
Yeah, Dr. Holt. Yes, please.
I think that that's sort of what Professor Hayden has said is perhaps generally true, although Vienna had large commemorations. They redid their entire war museum on that basis, which has a big, huge room dedicated to the assassination and all the other stuff. And actually, when I was in Vienna shortly before the actual whole business began, and I was contacted by several Serbian journalists who were quite interested to, in fact, look at the entire thing. The other thing to be said, and I quite agree that Christopher Clark's best-selling book is highly misleading in my view.
Damn.
All right.
Scheisse. Are we back? I can't tell. I hate this.
You're back. And the book was misleading, was where you left off. Yeah.
Okay. And I like Chris Clark as a person. He's fine. But that book, I think, is a disaster. But it's interesting that Chris Clark is not a German and he's not an Austrian. In Germany, at least, this line, although the public is buying the book, I don't know what the public is making of the book, but German historians, on the whole, are not they are not whitewashing Germany. And at most, you would see a milder form of revisionism. That has to do with rejecting some of the more what some people think of as extreme claims of Fritz Fischer, but in basically arguing that the war was not inevitable, which is a very different position than arguing that a bunch of sleepwalkers got into a problem, or in the German phrase, wir sind hineingeschlittert. That in Central Europe, at least in my experience, that is not the total revisionist view, which goes back to Sidney B. Fay in 1920 and back to the so-called Innocence campaign of the German Foreign Office. That, for German historians anyway, I would say is truly not the norm.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in Austria they have a big exhibit on the assassination. That was Chris Clark, but that's like saying that the Vietnam War was caused by the Tonkin Gulf incident. I mean, it gave the Austrians the opportunity to do something that many of them wanted to do anyway, and that nobody expected them to do.
Yes,
the consequences would be a larger war.
The core Austrian decision makers had made their decision to go to war at the next best opportunity in October 1913, and this, you can read this in documentary accounts that are produced by the Austrian Academy of Sciences. So I mean, this is not coming out of left field, and you're absolutely right that's completely true. And of course, Austria couldn't go to war without Germany's support, and the German support, in my view, was given not for a localized war and not in order to with the idea of risking a larger war, but actually with the idea of launching a larger war. And that makes World War I an enormously important event, because what was at stake there was international behavior, the right of smaller states and other states to exist. And this is the thing that has been missing from the commemorations, is if you get the beginning of the war wrong, you don't understand why the war was fought, why it was an extraordinarily important war, and why World War II is merely the second part of World War I. That's been missing nowadays, and it's a pity.
Absolutely.
Pierre, please, yes.
I might say something. So I'm interested in the lay representation of young Europeans, huh? And we asked a few thousands of them what were the main reasons for the beginning of the war. We had created 14 items with historians, and what is funny is that the reasons they perceive as the least important by far is a chance, and then it's the misunderstanding between people. And the reasons they consider as the most important is not nationalism. It's not just telling this country is responsible or not. It's just the greed of the elites, the willingness of power of the elites. So lay people, they do not represent war according to a national prism. They just represent it accordingly to kind of a vertical prism opposing elites to people. And the national prism is not important for them.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
really funny because as experts, we never talk about that. But
Yeah, does bring up a whole new set. Yeah, Dr. Arendt.
Okay, let me raise an issue of when did World War I end? Yes, it started at a certain date, but when did it end? And let me cite one statistic. You know, we talk about the Russian Empire, the casualties and so on, and deaths 1.7 million and so on. Laurel Engelstein, in a recent book on the Russian Revolution, put out these statistics that if you take Russia from 1918 to 1921, that is after Russia got out, the deaths are 15.5 million. Now, 10 million of those is famine deaths, etc. But still, the civil war and the terror, etc. in the course of the civil war. So the Russian Revolution itself is part of, you know, it happens in the context of the war, and then, you know, it carries on further. It is something, as we know, the Versailles treaty makers, people of the Paris Conference, were unable to solve or come up with a coherent Russia policy. This was, you know, along with the German question, perhaps a second important matter of discussion.
Yeah,
May
Dr.
I
Hall.
add
Sure.
something?
Yes, please.
That's absolutely critical that the war doesn't end until 1923. I think most historians would say that. And the spawning not just of the extra deaths, which are substantial, but the Russian Revolution and obviously fascism and ultimately National Socialism come out of the war and the way of understanding it, interpreting it, the organizations that come. But there's one other thing that everybody always forgets, and that's the flu epidemic, which everyone imagines is somehow, they think of that as, I don't know what, chance or whatever. There's very good evidence that, in fact, the flu was did not arise actually in Asia, which is normally what happens, or in the Far East, that it arose actually in Etaples, which was an enormous holding place for Allied soldiers who were being then sluiced into the Western Front. And if you add, and then it was spread around the globe by soldiers and transports. If you add those deaths, that's, you know, a kind of conservative estimate is 30 million people. And I might also say that the number of deaths of civilians in World War I is simply unknown, and I suspect that it's very high. And the number of civilian deaths in East Africa is very high. It's, you know, way up there. So, I mean, this really was a great war, capital G, capital W, in every respect. Politics, economics, world health, culture, society, in every single way. And I will repeat once again, this was just the first installment. World War II really is the second part of World War I.
Well, I think we couldn't possibly end on a better note than that. Thank you so much for that summary. And I mean, if the war, since we're giving it now until 1923, I call that we should just reconvene in 5 years, and we'll do this again, and we'll have better technology set up for everyone.
Thank you.
So thank you all for your contributions, your insights, your patience, and I thank you all for joining us, and look forward to our next installment, which will be on 25 years of the European single market. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.